Hello, Aubrey here, and today I'm asking the question, how much can be accomplished in 200 days in Stardew Valley? Can you fully upgrade your home and complete the community upgrades? How about complete all of the in-game achievements? What about collecting 100 hats to adorn your mannequin army to eventually take over the... Guess we're just gonna have to wait and find out. I hope you enjoy as we take a look at Azure's whirlwind route to perfection and beyond on Cobalt Farm. We're kicking off the next 100 days with Azure, Emily, and the spirits all in high spirits. Clint was trying to get into Azure's good graces by sending her a copper bar, then immediately requested she bring him an iron bar. The nerve of that guy. Before heading to see Clint, Azure stopped in to gift the wizard for his birthday and handed over a void essence he'd requested. Then it was on to the belligerent blacksmith to hand over the bar, and to request a pan upgrade. Azure only had a few fish left to reel in, so she set her sights on the lava eel that afternoon, as that level of the mines was also a great place to work on the community cleanup request she'd picked up from Linus. The last stop before the night market was to hand over what I can only assume will become bedding for the raccoons, and in return, they gave Azure a neat-looking jungle tank. At the night market later on, Azure made sure to hand over loved gifts to residents she saw there to work on another quest of the key kind. The mutant bugs weren't happy to see Azure fishing in their lair that night, so she left quickly after catching the slime jack she was after. And upon heading to bed, Emily asked if they should expand their happy little family. Azure said yes, of course. Mail time on day 102. Azure received the fiber seed recipe from Linus, and Mayor Lewis let her know her secret friend for the Winter Star Festival is Penny. Okie dokie. Azure needs to work on that relationship anyways. And speaking of relationships, Azure headed into town that morning with bags packed, ready to hand out more loved gifts to everyone she could, stopping briefly to do a little shopping with the dwarf and Krobus as she edged Cobalt Farm ever closer towards perfection. Then, it was back to gifting, and Azure making quite a bit of progress on that quest. The next day, Azure took care of her key crops before heading out for what would hopefully be her final day of gifting for the week, though she would fall a bit short of the goal in the desert that afternoon, opting instead to collect wood while there, along with, whatever this is. On day 104, Azure dropped off that strange doll at the museum and gifted Granny Evelyn a diamond for her birthday. She also stopped in to have Robin make a few house renovations, though most required her to do a bit of redecorating before she'd be able to finish the expansions. So Azure settled for buying all the recipes Robin had in stock. Back home, she put the expanded dining room to good use before taking to the river in search of one of the two final fish needed for the collection, the Dorado, which she caught shortly after 9 o'clock that night with the help of some magic bait. Now, there was only one fish remaining, but Azure was down to her last 10 pieces of magic bait. Would she be able to reel in the red snapper before her bait was out? It was looking kind of dicey, but on her very last piece of bait, Azure managed to hook the little red fiend. Now, I know this is no feat like catching every fish in a single day, but I think becoming a master angler within her first year in the valley is still rather impressive. Willie thought so as well, as he mailed Azure a coveted star drop the very next morning. Azure had not yet finished Key's kindness quest, but it looks like she'd saved the very last gift of the quest to be one for her lovely wife. Later that day, she headed over to the desert for a new batch of starfruit seeds and for a little casino-style gambling in order to pick up the rare crow sold there. That scarecrow turned out to be the final one needed for the collection, so Azure was sent the deluxe scarecrow recipe in the mail the next morning, and she crafted it after taking care of a few other farm chores. The bookseller was back in town, and Azure took the opportunity to purchase the Queen of Sauce cookbook. When read, this book teaches any recipe you'd normally receive from watching the Queen of Sauce every Sunday, greatly expediting the ability to complete the cooking achievement needed for perfection. Clint had finished with the final pan upgrade, and Azure set him back to work on the penultimate trash can upgrade. Since Clint was helping her out so much with tools, Azure agreed to tackle the cave patrol quest he'd posted in town. Then she headed to the island, where there was a lot of starfruit farming to do. After the fields were replanted that night, Azure stopped in to see what Mr. Key was requesting of her this week, ultimately selecting the extended family quest, and picking up the heavy tapper recipe from his wares. Clint must have misunderstood Azure's cordiality with him, because that night, that little snake decided to try and hit on Emily, right in front of Azure. What in tarnation, Clintorino? You know darn well that Emily is not available. Good night, sir. Day 107, Azure gave Leah a salad for her birthday, and while in the area, decided to pick up Foraging Mastery with the level she had available before starting on Key's quest to fish up the legendary family. Maru traded a pike for a prize ticket, that Azure traded for a magic rock candy, then it was back to a fruitless hunt for an evasive legendary fish. Leah stopped by the next morning in her adorable blue winter jumper, gifting Azure a handmade sculpture. Azure had smoked the bonus legendary carp the night before, so into the shipping bin it went. Then it was back inside to cook up a few dishes, before Azure headed to the forest to hook another of the extended fishy family, or two. She headed down to the docks next to reel in the Crimson Sun, followed by Lady Angler north of town. As it was the final day of the quest, Azure headed to the mountain lake next, where she hauled up a feisty Legend 2, earning the promised key gems, officially catching every fish in the game that very first year, and letting profits override sentimentality. Bye-bye, Legend Guy. Glacier Jr. was the next fish into the frying pan, but it looks like his brother and the son of Crimson Fish are safe from the fire, for now. With Cookie set out for the big guy, Azure tucked into bed, ready for tomorrow's festivities. Ooh, prezzies! But before it was time to head into town, Azure made a musky pit stop in the mines, where she slayed a few skellies for Clint. Once at the festivities, Azure handed a Stardrop tea to Penny, then received a pumpkin pie from Pam. Back home that night, Azure shipped a large quantity of Key's cool blue fruit, allowing her to finish up that quest with plenty of time to spare. If only that profit margin was a bit better. The next morning, Azure came across Penny and the kiddos having a questionable picnic field trip in the snow, while on her way to check on her raccoon friends and to purchase a brown chicken named Big for the egg needed for shipping completion. A prize ticket was waiting outside the mayor's house, but she didn't redeem it just yet, opting to make her way over to gift Clint some fresh artichoke dip for his birthday. He oughta choke on that. Sheesh, even Clint doesn't appreciate my jokes. Anywho, Azure picked up her golden trash can before placing an order for her watering can to be upgraded next. Then, snagged the Stardrop tea waiting in Lewis's prize machine. Day 111, Emily reminded Azure their family would soon be growing, and that afternoon, she headed over to see Morris about the entertainment opportunity Joja now had available. Despite his sales pitch, Morris seemed shocked that she had taken him up on the offer, but Azure was clearly set on making the valley the most enjoyable place to live now that she and Emily had a little one on the way. It was a boys' day at the beach, and once there, Azure made it a real party with some pizzas. And salmon, apparently? While still on the island, she picked up the hopper and fertilizer recipes from Mr. Key's stock, then headed back home to empty and refill kegs with that profitable starfruit wine. Gotta refill the coppers after her latest reckless purchase after all. On the final day of the year, Azure chanced into the luckiest panning spot she's had to date. She definitely learned that from Poxiel, not me. Home renovations were next on her to-do list, and since it was the last day for cheap materials, Azure picked up a few stacks of stone from Robin while there. Pierre was stocked with the sugar and wheat Azure needed for many of her baking recipes, and, not to be outdone by the boys yesterday, the ladies of the valley were all heading to the docks for a nice island getaway. Azure caught Emily on her way, and the two made plans for a movie night once Emily returned. The rest of the day, Azure spent her time stocking up on starfruit seeds for summer and handing out gifts to residents. Then it was time to head back to the valley to see her very first movie at the new theater. Looks like it's a double date night at the old cinema tonight. Before heading to bed, Azure decorated one of the new rooms for Emily to use for her sewing crafts. Not everyone was happy to see the start of the new year, but Leah was taking full advantage of this less frigid season to have her art show in town that afternoon. Kent also dropped by that morning to introduce himself to Azure, and this marks the start of the Get Kent to Max Hearts timer. You'll see her around? Yes you will. Once in town, Azure picked up a quest Emily posted asking to say hi to everyone in the valley, before heading over to officially talk to Kent for the day. Gunther was in need of 100 bones by the end of the week, so Azure headed to the island where she handed over a banana for a few walnuts before breaking nodes to start on her bone collection. Another bone collection was completed that afternoon when Azure donated the final specimen to the Field Museum. And then Azure paid off the Joja Parrot to find the rest of the walnuts. I guess she really didn't want to mess around with that Simon Says headache ever again. Leah's art show was in full swing when she arrived back in town, though it's a shame Azure can't take advantage of the gathering to work on Emily's meet and greet quest. Her last stop of the evening was to pick up some garlic seeds right before Pierre closed up shop, though she ran out of time to plant them that night after working on a bit of crop layout reorganization. The golden parrots were also hard at work that evening, collecting the final walnuts from here, there, and everywhere around the island. Azure had made great progress on the quests she picked up yesterday, but before she worked on them further, she headed into the volcano, trekking up to the 5th floor, where she purchased the shortcut with her newly acquired walnuts, and the Diamond Hunter book from the dwarf vendor there. The parrot-collected walnuts meant that Azure could now visit Mr. Key in his walnut room, which she did, and while there, traded in the excess walnuts for key gems in order to purchase key seasoning to assist in her Kent befriending plans. Azure also selected the Skull Cavern Invasion quest offered up for 40 key gems before heading to the beach to gift Leo and to see if anyone there was needed for Emily's meet and greet quest. Next, Azure headed back to the farm to whip up a few specially seasoned fiddlehead risotto, one of which she handed over to Kent while it was still piping hot. Tuesday meant Robin was out for most of the day, but Azure was able to intercept her on the way home to request a stable be built on the farm. And finally, she rushed over to the saloon, where she greeted the final person needed for Emily's quest, old Clintorino. Azure made it back to the farm in time that night to refill kegs and clean up a bit more of her crops held over from the prior season. The next morning, Azure had more jarring and kegging to do before heading back outside for a total crop field overhaul. On her way to the Wizards that afternoon, Azure brought the carrot juice and pickled green beans that the raccoons requested, only to receive a large egg. Wonder where they snagged that from. Once at the Wizard's Tower, she built a few Junimo huts to help out with harvest. Then it was a hop, skip, and a jump to pick up her final trash can upgrade from Clint, and on to the museum to hear Elliot read portions of his first book, aptly titled Blue Tower. Must have been a decent novel, as both Azure and Emily stayed for the entire reading. Azure found Kent relaxing under a tree, so she gifted him another Gold Star risotto, and that evening she made it over to the island to harvest and replant starfruit. That scythe really makes short work of the field. So short, in fact, that Azure made it home in plenty of time that night to welcome their new baby boy, Jay. Thanks to Emily, Azure didn't have much she could do to help out around the house, so she headed out in the rain to greet her new steed, Tardis. It was afternoon by the time Azure finished fully setting up the Junimo fields and was able to plant a large patch of rhubarb and a smaller section of carrots and garlic. Her first stop once off the farm was to the movie theater, where she snagged the tickets needed to invite Kent to see a show. It was his birthday after all. But before she got to gifting Kent, Azure handed over the war memento she'd picked up on the island last year. Then it was time to hand over a 3-day-old risotto that he could wash down with a cup of Stardrop tea. Holy heart gains. Kent didn't seem too excited about catching a movie, but he did meet up with Azure later that evening, and didn't even seem to mind how long she spent at the crane game before the show, as they ended off the outing with 9 hearts of friendship, and Azure headed home with a few new toys for Jay to play with. When he's older, of course. Having a child apparently gave Emily baby fever, but can you blame her looking at this cute little burrito? That morning, Azure made sure to gift her Junimo pals the raisins she dehydrated the night before, and chatted with Kent about fish by the river before jetting off to the desert for the day. Once there, she purchased a stack of starfruit seeds, gave Sandy the rose she'd gotten from Gus for giving him the tomato salt from Kent, picked up the desert warp totem recipe, and headed into Skull Cavern on a bit of a sugar high. The monsters in the mines were a bit extreme, but Azure was able to expand her combat knowledge as she took on Key's invasion quest, though she decided to call it quits just after midnight when it was clear she'd not reach floor 100 in time that night. Plus, there were jars needing filled back at the farm. That golden clock wasn't going to buy itself. Spoiler alert, neither the clock nor Azure were in fact going to make that purchase. Saturday morning meant there was more wine ready for shipping. Emily had sent Azure a little love note asking for a fresh apricot, and the Woods were requesting a drizzle of syrup. The apricot tree wasn't fully grown in the greenhouse, so Azure made her first stop of the morning be the Secret Woods, where she hesitantly approached a bear with maple syrup in hand. Next, she found Shane hanging out with these blue feathered beauties. They sure would look right at home on Cobalt Farm. Welcome kablooey to the coop. Azure brought George the remote she'd collected from Sandy before heading to the wizard to collect the wriggling worm that she handed over to Willy before having him sail her back to the island to finally finish the pirate's wife quest. After all, Azure needed the recipe Birdie would teach her for this quest, and, fun fact, Birdie had somehow hidden 5 walnuts from the parrots, as Azure was still rewarded with them even after she'd paid the Joja Parrot fee. That night, Azure checked in on her shipping progress and placed any items she could in the bin. On day 119, Azure awoke to her lovely blue Junimo friends harvesting some carrots. Since the gifting week had reset, she headed over to see Kent and was thrust into an uncomfortable domestic squabble. But Kent proved to be a man of understanding, and with her final gold quality risotto, Azure was able to reach max hearts with Kent less than a week after meeting him. Countdown completed. With that out of the way, Azure dropped by to have Clint start on her final watering can upgrade and turned in the 100 bone fragments Gunther was after. Then she was back on the farm, shipping flowers and fruits. I'm sure Emily won't mind waiting another day for that apricot. The rest of the evening, Azure spent cooking and crafting, taking only a quick break to have dinner with the residents of 1 Willow Lane. On Monday morning, Azure headed to town and accepted the Gifts for George quest posted by Evelyn. Then went to the Walnut Room where she snagged the Extended Family quest from Mr. Key, but instead of starting either quest, she spent that afternoon cooking and determining what other ingredients she'd need to finish making every dish. Good thing she left a bit of space there in the greenhouse. By that night, she was down to only 4 recipes left to cook, and later celebrated her hard work by picking up the combat skill from the Mastery Cave. On Tuesday, Azure's watering can was ready for pickup, and then it was time to refill kegs in the shed, before finally starting on the Extended Family fishing quest, where she caught the Legend 2 in the mountains. Azure also caught Robin on her way home that night, and put in a request for a shed upgrade, taking the opportunity to cozy up the color scheme of the house and farm buildings. Azure had smoked and shipped the Legend 2 the night before, and catching more legends for profit was on her day's to-do list, right after gifting Vincent for his birthday, that is. Today, Azure hauled the smoker up to the mountains, so she was able to transfer each catch from the lake to bake with relative ease. Although she spent most of the day fishing, she was only able to haul in 3 legends before calling it for the night. The seemingly endless cycle of jarring continued on day 123, and Azure finally gave Emily the apricot she'd been waiting for all week, though, to be fair, Emily could have just strolled over to the greenhouse to grab one herself. Caviar was on the short list of things Azure had left to ship, so it's only natural that Azure requested Robin start building a fish pond the following day. She spent the evening in the volcano, snagging dragon teeth that were needed for several crafting recipes, but only managed to get 3 before piecing out of the volcano on floor 5. On day 124, Azure fully filled her iridium greenhouse sprinklers with the low-maintenance and lovely-hued ancient fruit crops, then picked up a couple rare seeds, one of which she planted in the open greenhouse plot. Then it was time to head to the island to cycle the starfruit, which took Azure almost the entire evening to complete. She must have realized that Creme was still in winter attire because she swapped out her Santa hat for a friendly froggy head just before heading to bed. Day 125 was the annual Egg Festival, which meant Azure didn't have time to do much after spending the morning picking up finished kitchen kegs to set up in her newly expanded shed. Once at the festival, she hunted down a respectable 12 eggs and was rewarded with a prize ticket for her efforts. Since it was Saturday, she spent the night looking for leeks for George before the forage reset that next morning. Sunday morning, Azure continued with her spring cleaning from the prior day by moving the jars from the bedroom down into the dining room where the kegs had been. Then she filled up her pack with loved gifts to take a lap around town on the hunt for hearts instead of eggs today. Ah yes, and Clint had her hoe ready and waiting for pickup. After taking the dwarf to the movies that night, Azure had only a few hearts left to max out friendships with the majority of the villagers. Emily was up early the next morning with a cup of coffee waiting for Azure. And she was gonna need it, because today marked the start of the bustling desert festival. Sure, Azure had made it there the year before, but she'd been much less skilled back then. This year, she'd be better prepared for all the festival had to offer. It was approaching noon by the time Azure made it out to Calico. She set right to work accepting quests and looting bins. She even made time to let Emily give her another makeover before completing Willie's fishing challenge and heading into the cavern for some afternoon spelunking. After hitting a dino floor on level 39, Azure decided she would have better luck collecting the final geodes needed for the desert quest if she went back to the earlier levels. By 1 AM, she had collected the final geode and was awarded 40 calico eggs. Side note, on these festival nights, the villagers stay out really late, and it's a perfect time to hand over presents. The following morning, Azure took care of keg organization in the shed, then made her way over to see how Emily was doing at her clothing box, and was roped into yet another garment swap. Browns to blend in with the desert, it seems. Azure turned in the Scorpion Carp Challenge to Willie for 50 calico eggs before heading into Skull Cavern to attempt reaching floor 30 per Marlin's request. On floor 26, Azure found a chest holding an adorable blue-green frog egg, so of course she equipped that trinket immediately and said hello to her new little froggy friend. Whoa, that frog has quite the appetite. With her new pal in tow, Azure made it down to floor 80 before deciding to call it for the night. She is racking up quite the egg collection this year. Day 129, Jay was finally awake, so Azure headed up to give him a toss or two. The last day of the festival was today, but Azure couldn't resist collecting the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow before driving herself to the event. With the egg collection she'd amassed the previous days, Azure picked up a pretty blue bow, the mummy mask, and the goodnight shirt Maru was selling. Then it was time for the customary fitting room escapades with her wife. Interesting costume choice? As she still had a lot of eggs, Azure headed back to Maru's stall where she bought out the iridium bars and as many strawberry seeds as she could. Instead of heading to the cavern today, Azure wolfed down a tasty treat and started her adventure in the danger mines back in the valley. With the help of Buffs and her bouncy friend, she made short work of the first 30 challenge levels that night. Although she'd raced back home, Azure did not have time to finish planting the crops like she'd hoped and ended up passing out right there in the dirt. Looks like the Junimos have an extra item to collect in the morning. And Dr. Harvey apparently collected a hefty fee for his services. Azure finished up her seed planting the next morning, found a bait and bobber book in a wormy patch, how fitting, then spent the afternoon making more progress in the danger mines. Azure made it down another 30 levels, but a tummy ache caused her to head home well before the sleepy hours. Day 131 was a bit of rinse, lather, repeat, but instead of farming before the mines, Azure took to the secret woods and the island to fetch hardwood for Robin. With the 80 wood handed over later that evening, Azure was ready to dive back into the depths of the mine and made it to floor 70 before heading to bed. With only 2 days and 50 floors left to descend, Azure headed back to the danger mines relatively early on day 132, finding her first galaxy soul on floor 78 and making it all the way down to floor 105 shortly after midnight. Sunday. Azure was back in the mines bright and early, even using staircases as needed to reach the final floor in time to visit the island for a lucrative starfruit harvest. With the key gems from the danger mines in hand, Azure picked up the key to the town, along with Pierre's missing stock list. Before leaving the island that night, Azure took a trip to the volcano caldera to combine a couple rings. Azure woke up on the island and immediately headed over to pick up a new quest from Key, then set to work gifting villagers she was not yet max hearts with. Back in town, she picked up the fishing quest posted by Demetrius, handed his stock list and some sashimi over to Pierre, and planted any open spots with various spring seeds she had stocked up. Jas was currently lowest on the relationship leaderboard, so Azure sought to fix that with a fairy rose and a trip to the movies, making sure to head to the theater early enough so that Jas would be back well before bedtime, and so that Azure had enough time to catch halibut for Demetrius with the aid of the very helpful baitmaker. The next morning, Evelyn sent Azure a coffee maker for giving her a dozen leaks the previous day, but I don't think she'll be squashing her Joja Cola addiction anytime soon. It was on this day that Azure finally filled out her it was on this day that Azure almost filled out her shed with kegs anyways. She'd picked up a quest to catch sunfish, so she took to the river that afternoon to do just that. then spent the evening handing out gifts to max hearts with even more townsfolk, and crafting any recipes she had the materials on hand for. The day the flower dance arrived, and after giving a kiss to her wife, Azure headed to the dance and asked Sebastian to be her dance partner. Okay, maybe her frog buddy made her do it? It is rather cute how the little guy hangs out by her feet while Azure does her fancy dance squats. Come to think of it, it looks like Azure has taken a liking to frogs as well. Day 137 started off with a bang as Azure headed to the Mastery Cave for the final time this run. Anyone else feel that sudden chill in the air? With Mastery now out of the way, there was not much else for Azure to focus on aside from perfection. And at this point, perfection ultimately means funds, in the form of starfruit and starfruit wine. So after purchasing a stack of seeds, Azure got to work clearing out most of the trees she'd planted seasons ago in the desert, and placed more tappers on the oak trees back on the farm. All that wood and oak resin would be put to good use making kegs in the near future. Robin added to Azure's wood stores the next morning, and Azure started a chest to store items needed to build obelisks on her farm. Looks like she is mighty low on cactus fruit and dragon teeth, but that seems like a problem for another day. One birthday gift to Pierre later, and he joined Azure's Max Hearts Club, and Azure found out she had a number of monsters to eradicate before she could join the Protector of the Valley Club, so back to the mine she went for the rest of the evening. The next morning, Emily seemed surprised that Azure remembered her birthday. Who hurt you? Might have been in honor of Emily's birthday, but today was one for the birds, as Azure swapped out her froggy companion for a parrot. Abigail was looking for a leek, so Azure agreed to deliver one, but first she headed to the island where Linus bird-talked his way into Leo's good graces. Emily was vacationing on the island for her birthday and didn't want to head back home to catch a flick, so Azure picked a few crops before warping back. Next, she headed to the desert for a cactus seed and to take a mini dive in the cavern. Nothing too exciting happened there, and she headed out around midnight. The cactus seed was planted next to the kitchen counter, and Leo's parrot pals began construction on his new home in the valley. On the final day of the season, Azure packed her bag and drove herself to Calico for a day-long excursion. She traded in jade for staircases before heading to the cavern and finding a helpful hole on the very first level. A crystallarium was waiting for her on floor 32, along with 5 golden mystery boxes just 10 floors later. As midnight approached, Azure pulled out her staircases to make traversing the floors go quicker, pausing briefly on floor 95 before finding her way to Mr. Key on floor 100. Not a bad way to close out the season. I never understood how a farm becomes so messy with just a season shift, but c'est la vie. Azure spent the entire morning setting up her fields for maximum starfruit production, finishing up just in time to process the starfruit wine now ready in her shed. She followed this up with a change of fruit in the jars back home before filling up a few more kegs for good measure. There were only a few more villagers for Azure to win over, so one of her goals for today was handing out treats, which worked better for some than others. Azure couldn't resist picking up the quest Willy posted for tropical fish, but made sure to see Leo before heading to the island because he was now an official valley resident. It was still early when Azure made it to her island farm, where she downed some soup and got to work turning over the crops. Key was looking for prismatic shards and Azure agreed to help, and according to the perfection tracker, she still had a lot of work to do, but not so much that she couldn't take a trip to the pit with Emily to hype up their friends, particularly Abigail, as it doesn't look like any of her family made it out. Pierre, I would expect this from, but Caroline? Later that night, Azure was back on the island collecting fish for Willy. She woke up on the island the next morning and went right back to fishing before heading to the volcano as she still needed several dragon teeth. Although she stayed there most of the day, not a single lurker dropped what Azure was after, and once back on the farm, what in the world is that creepy crawly? Jay was also being a creepy crawly the next morning. Time to break out the safety locks and maybe move that cactus out of his room. Willy sent Azure a fancy deluxe fish tank that she placed directly in the overstock chest inside. I'm sure she'll set that up later. Azure was able to harvest her first mystic syrup and sweet gemberry, so into the shipping bin they went. She had only 3 villagers left to gift, and after gifting Jas for her birthday, she was down to 2. The Stardrop tea from the vending machine would certainly help with 1. After giving Leo a gold quality poi, she gifted him the tea, bumping him up to 8 hearts, and surpassing the dwarf slightly in the race to finish friendship gains. Azure spent the rest of the evening farming radioactive ore in the mines, making it home with over 100 ore to smelt. The green rain was back on day 145, so it's no surprise that Azure spent the entire day clearing out weeds and trees now scattered about the valley. While I don't think the green rain is entirely sinister, one tree in particular was trying to block access to the barn. Azure made it home that night with over 600 fiber and nearly 300 moss. The moss was put to use the next day when Azure crafted some blue starter grass and a statue of blessing. She was so close to completing both the bat and rock crab eradication goals, so Azure took a trip to the mines, where she took out a few rock crabs, and a helpful bat swarm put her over the edge on that goal as well. Azure started decorating the mini island the next morning, on which she placed the mini obelisk for easy transport across the farm. The gifting week had reset, and Azure made a stop to gift the dwarf a topaz, before taking him to see a movie that afternoon. Then she spent time in the desert clearing out trees for a copious amount of wood. Wine was the topic of day 148, as both house wine and shed wine were ready for collection. Wine completed, Azure gave the dwarf the final gift needed to reach max hearts. With only Leo left to befriend, she headed to the island, where she gave Gus a birthday present, and headed home before ever finding Leo to gift him the poi in her pack. Azure did give food to Old Master Cannoli that night in exchange for a star drop, and visited the wizard to place down the ocean and earth obelisk on Cobalt Farm's mini island. Leo had eluded her so far this week, so the poi took up permanent residence in Azure's bag, in case she came across him out in the valley. And she managed to find him this morning in the most unlikely place. A trip to the desert meant a stock up on starfruit seeds, then Azure took to the cavern in search of the 2 serpents needed for eradication goal completion. She was able to find them shortly after noon, but continued her descent until deciding to warp home at 1 a.m. Azure awoke on day 150 to the first starfruit harvest of the Junimos, and she placed a few more grapes in the dehydrators to ensure their huts stayed stocked with raisins. The Junimos did an amazing job with the harvest, but Azure did need to run through and reseed all the plots later that morning. Leo was not in his treehouse that evening, and while waiting to see if he'd show, Azure took a trip over to Joja, where she picked up a couple auto petters. Then she went back to the mountains, but he was still not home. Eventually, she gave up the hunt for Leo, opting instead to build the desert obelisk on one of her waiting island platforms, before heading to the farm to place an auto petter in the barn and coop, respectively. Emily decorated with a cute plant on the morning of day 151, and Azure finally ran into Leo right before jetting off to the island to change over the starfruit crops waiting there. She opted to forgo the luau today for the opportunity to hunt down more dragon teeth needed for that final obelisk to the island, and while she stayed there the whole night, she only managed to collect 3 before passing out in the volcano. Bright and early the next morning, she was back in the volcano, collecting another 3 teeth before passing out yet again on the island. Hope she let Emily know what she'd be up to. Azure finally headed home on day 153, having not reached the 10 teeth needed, but clearly having missed her family over the past few days. The trip home was brief though, as Azure was sailing back to the island before lunchtime, and set to work immediately back in the volcano. On floor 6, she came across the last 2 teeth she needed, just waiting there on the floor. The volcano luck didn't end there, as she picked up another lovely parrot egg and deluxe pirate hat later on floor 9. Once finished in the volcano, Azure dug up the ostrich egg before racing home, making it to bed just in time. There was an ostrich egg incubator hanging out in storage, so Azure snagged it, then hesitated awkwardly by the bin as she contemplated just shipping off the egg for completion. Ultimately, she placed the incubator and egg in the barn, and headed off to see the wizard, where she rearranged obelisks before purchasing the final of the 4. Azure brought mystery boxes for Clint to open that afternoon, discovering all manner of nifty things, including this questionable top hat. The contents of the boxes were used as inspiration to update the sewing room, leading to a complete restyling of the mannequins therein. Then it was wine shed time for Azure. Monday morning meant a new special order was posted, and Azure picked up Gus's omelet request before asking Clint to open a few geodes to find donations for the museum. She's getting so close to completing the collection, so she headed back to Clint where she uncovered an appraisal guide and was able to donate all but 2 of the artifacts needed. After digging up one of the 2, Azure ran into Leo and gifted him a poi that she now perpetually carried until he reaches 10 hearts, that is. She used a treasure totem in the forest entrance, but could not find the final amphibian fossil needed for museum completion. That afternoon, Azure grabbed a couple dozen eggs from the coop to place in Gus's omelet fridge, and once on the island that night, she saw she was tantalizingly close to completion on a lot of the tracker goals, and picked up a new key quest to traverse the caverns sans sustenance. A trip to the volcano on day 156 gave Azure the opportunity to upgrade her sword, re-rolling until she acquired the Crusader enchantment, allowing for the dispatch of mummies, no bombs required. Back on the farm, the jelly was ready for rejarring, and with the help of some deluxe retaining soil, Azure tore down the leftmost plants to be replanted with a final group of ancient fruit. She also set up a few garden pots using mixed flower seeds to really gussy up the place. That night, Azure took a look at eradication goal progress. The Crusader enchantment will really help out with that mummy goal. It seems she wanted to bump up her luck stats, so the next day, Azure met with the friendly Joja driver who traded a rabbit's foot for a different sort of lucky charm. Only one book to go until her special items and powers tab is complete, the horse book, which could be purchased the next time the bookseller is in town, which is tomorrow. Nice! But for today, Azure took to the volcano to work on magma sprite eradication. Azure was prepping to take on Key's Cavern quest on day 158, so she stopped by the museum to pick up a handy treat and made sure to grab Horse, the book, for a quick read on the way home. How well read of her indeed. Azure selected the ladder power from the statue of the Dwarf King before warping her way to the Calico Desert. The buffs were hard at work as Azure found her first treasure room on floor 10. On floor 60, she was able to work on the Pepper Rex eradication goal and managed to reach floor 100 by 10 p.m., with the help of staircases, of course. It was raining the next morning, so Azure took care of the harvest and replanted the fields with the final batch of starfruit for the season. She took a trip to the desert next to replenish her seed reserves for the island, and while there, stumbled across a second person somehow surviving in the dig site mushroom cave. I suppose there is flowing water and a relatively decent food source in there. Fizz gave Azure the rundown on perfection waivers and seemed a friendly enough fellow all donned in blue, but she didn't take him up on the offer, opting instead to return home to refill jars with freshly pickled starfruit, followed by a trip to the mines to eradicate some monsters living there. Day 160 was Starfruit Saturday as Azure harvested and replanted the island crops, even expanding the starfruit to take over the top left plots. The shed was finished processing, so Azure collected wine and refilled kegs well into the night, having to finish the kegs in the house early the next morning. Azure came across the largest herd of Logalurkers I've ever seen later that morning, and was able to collect the final tooth she needed to craft the mini forge once back home. She had exact change to purchase a Galaxy Soul from Mr. Key, and after crafting her home forge, used the soul to give her sword the final upgrade, Ultimate Cosmic Power, before heading back to the mines for the evening, where she finished the Slime and Void Spirit eradication goals in no time. Using the Slime Charmer and Burglar's Ring, she made the ultimate cave diving accessory. Azure put her new ring to use the next day when she took a trip to Skull Cavern to hunt down more monster mobs for Marlin. On summer 23rd, Azure handed over Moss and Topaz to the raccoons. In return, they gave her the ostrich egg she was missing for shipping completion. Raccoons can do that? That must have reminded her she had an egg in the incubator, because Azure's next stop was to the barn to greet her new ostrich, Bird Blue, and she dropped the reward egg into the shipping bin. At some point, Azure had reached max hearts with Leo, but she hadn't talked to him since last week, so it must have been the bonus friendship for gifting twice the week prior. Either way, Azure was inching ever closer to every one of her perfection goals, aside from the millions needed for the golden clock. She was making money off artisan starfruit goods, but was it enough? With the help of a few bombs in the quarry, Azure was able to collect the rest of the stone she'd needed for Robin's resource rush that evening, and spent the rest of the night hunting for Dougies in the upper levels of the mines. Thanks to the kindness of the raccoons, Azure finished her shipping goals overnight, and Robin mailed her one of the final crafting recipes she needed. Today was Willie's birthday, and Azure spent the morning keeping him company fishing on the dock. Later, Azure asked Robin for a second pet bowl and caught a few rainbow trout for a quest while up in the mountains. Since there were only a few magma sprites left for the eradication goal, Azure headed back to the volcano where she slayed the final one needed just before 10 p.m. The next morning, Azure stopped by to see the dwarf about the big stone chest recipe, now available since completing Robin's research quest earlier that week. And this was the final item she needed to make to become a true craft master. In the cavern later that night, Azure slayed the final mummy, leaving only the elusive Pepper Rex for completion of that perfection goal. 31 down, 19 to go. Before heading to bed, Azure decided to switch up her fishing profession, electing pirate to increase her chances for treasure. The final Friday of summer, Azure handed over 4 prismatic shards and picked up the extended family fishing quest from Key. With her Prizzy key gem, Azure purchased the Junimo chest, placing one on her island farm and the other back home on her farm. At the beach later that morning, Azure crafted up crimson fish bait. The bait turned out wholly ineffective, but she did fish up something even better than a crimson fish. With the last artifact donated, Azure skipped happily out of the museum, clearly forgetting that she needed to talk to Gunther again for her star drop reward. She headed back to the eastern pier and managed to catch 10 son of crimson fish that would give decent profits once all were smoked. Artifact now collected, Azure swapped her fishing profession again that night, but before she could pick out her profession, Wiggly gave birth to a baby pig, Biggly. Azure went back to Angler, by the way. Bright and starfruity day 167, Azure set to work turning over the kegs, then went to see Robin about house upgrades, lots of house upgrades. She finally realized she forgot something at the museum yesterday. Yep, there you go. And once back home, shipped off a large batch of artisan goods for those lovely profits. Azure had kept up with the speed grow starfruit such that the final batch was ready for harvest on the last day of summer. She traded 20 golden mystery boxes in for a magic rock candy that she used at the cavern to help with her dive. Azure was on the hunt for Pepper Rex. What else? She found a prehistoric floor just as the dance of the moonlight jellies began, managing to dispatch them all, still making it to the beach in time to buy a few beautiful blue banners and joining Emily on the dock for an amazing end of the season. The first of fall meant Azure was out setting up the fields most of the morning, selecting artichokes as her primary crop of the season. Farming continued into the night when Azure headed to the island to swap out her starfruit for fresh seeds. With only 7 Pepper Rex to go, Azure found herself back in the desert for more cave diving on day 170. But the Pepper Rex were few and far between, so she headed home that night without having reached her ultimate Slayer goal. First thing the next morning, she was back to the cavern before even having her coffee, and once again her slaying attempts were of no avail, but at least she actually made it into bed that night. You know what they say, if at first you don't succeed, luck into a dino floor before 10 a.m. of course. Eradication goals finally out of the way, Azure went home to make sure the farm was in order, even clearing out some hay for the next season and to make truffles easier to locate. Fall potted flowers were placed inside the greenhouse, and Azure even put a few inside in one of the new expansion cubbies. On the 5th of fall, Azure set up her fish smokers next to the mine entrance, spending the day farming for radioactive ore while smoking the fish she'd brought with between dives. And yes, she did this all day, leaving the mines with tons of smoked fish and over 100 radioactive ore ready to smelt. The next day was all about money, as Azure was only 1/4 of the way to the purchase price of the golden clock. But she did take a quick break from finances to give Jay a cute blue ball cap now that he was walking about. The raccoons had a new request waiting for Azure today, and since she had the requested items on hand, she brought them over right away. Nice, a star drop tea, but alas, Azure has no relationships left to work on. The Junimos were happily harvesting artichokes on day 175, and Azure had lots of artisan products cluttering up the kitchen and dining area to take care of before replanting the fields with more artichokes. Then she was back on the hunt for lucrative radioactive ore, making sure to change her blacksmith profession to, well, blacksmith, for extra profits when the bars are sold. Azure picked up a jungle tank the raccoons were selling for the low price of 5 broken glasses. Then she was on to the desert for her customary starfruit seed bulk purchase. In the afternoon, she moved the shed to the furthest west island and commissioned another be built a little below. She had a lot of extra trinkets that she traded in at the guild for some pocket change. On a quick trip to the island, Azure picked up the Skull Cavern invasion quest and checked in to make sure the perfection tracker had tracked all the things. The radioactive bars were sold overnight, helping Azure to make an impressive $500,000 that day. Not much to report on day 177, as Azure spent most of the day organizing and starting a sewing crafts chest in Emily's little sewing room. Using gems, artifacts, and all the cloths she'd saved up, Azure started making clothes to fill up Emily's dresser. The extra artifacts were shipped off to make room for the next batch of sewing materials. Food! Azure was really getting into the sewing life, even setting up a couple looms to spin more cloth as she ran low. That night, she gave the Junimo crops a much-deserved glow-up before heading to sleep, and Emily must have been so impressed with all the work Azure did today, as she asked if they could adopt a second child. Robin had finished with the shed the next day, and that meant she was free to do the final house renovation. Azure took the opportunity to move around some other buildings on the farm and request an immediate shed upgrade. Spending continued as Azure dropped a cool $200K on the furniture catalog, but she was sure to recoup that cost and then some as the island starfruit was once again ready for harvest. The spirits were happy on day 179, and that gave Azure the perfect opportunity to head to the cavern for Scary Skull Cavern time. Thanks to a series of shafts, she was able to pass floor 30 around 10 AM, and progress continued in this vein as Azure made it to floor 100 before 9 that night. Later, she replaced all the grass on the used-to-be Coop Island with pretty blue grass starters, setting up a sign so that the animals knew to keep out until the grass had a chance to grow. Day 180, Azure took the morning to move chests and finish paving paths around the house, and checked to make sure her sign was keeping the animals at bay. That evening, she worked on cozying up the newest rooms and collecting overflow kegs to move into the second, now upgraded shed. Day 181, Azure woke up to a bank total of $5 million, halfway to the golden clock. And yet, there is another way to reach perfection added in version 1.6. And no, it doesn't involve her raccoon neighbors, even though they are perfectly cute. Remember Fizz from in the mushroom cave? Azure went to see him with her $5 million in hand, only to leave the cave with a little under $400,000 to her name. That is 10 waivers for a total of 10% perfection for those of you who are keeping track at home. Now, this does mean Azure would have to save up another $10 million if she ever wanted to purchase the golden clock. Her final purchase from the walnut room that morning had been the horse flute, allowing TARDIS to travel as the doctor intended. Once back home, Azure replanted the artichoke fields surrounding the Junimo huts and checked on the southern mushroom isle she discovered and cleaned up a few days ago. That night, she tailored even more garments for Emily's collection, eventually moving the machines down to the dining room to have more space for activities. On the second Sunday of fall, year 2, Azure awoke to what some would consider the ultimate display of perfection in Stardew Valley. And I must admit, seeing Azure standing there with Emily as the perfection parrots flew overhead was pretty magical. But what happens to the valley after their tireless farmer ascends the summit? I know personally that this is where a lot of my farming adventures end. That iteration of farmer never to be seen or heard from again. But what if there is more to Stardew Valley than making Grandpa and Mr. Key proud? Luckily for Azure, there is, because she has an entire town of neighbors, a few of whom she has the ability to brighten their day or make their life a little better. So she set off to do just that. Cue the 2 weeks post-perfection montage. Just like that, the season changed, and with it, Emily changed into her lovely winter attire. Azure traded in pine cones for a large quantity of powder melon seeds that she planted in the Junimo fields, along with a batch of winter seeds. Hat Mouse was the next stop, where Azure picked up the elegant turban, now available for completing all other achievements, and she spent the evening decorating the house to better reflect her little family. Jay helped Azure pick out a few rugs the next morning, then it was time for hat organization. Azure had collected 100 unique hats, with 96 stored in her hat chest, a totem hat masquerading as an actual totem somewhere in another, one hat on Jay and one on herself, and of course, her iridium pan that can in fact be placed on head. She kept up the profiteering because who knows when Joja might scheme up another community upgrade project. That evening, she continued decorating and began to set up a few friends she picked up on a trip to the desert, with the friend she found in the quarry mine a bit closer to keep an eye on him. On day 199, Azure had Clint open a few dozen geodes to add to the materials on hand for her final tailoring project. Clothing acquired, Azure began to put together outfits for her mini-manny mob. Here it is, folks, the final day. Up in the attic, Azure set up the cursed mannequin with a replica of Mr. Key's wardrobe and flanked him with two ladies that she dressed in the very outfits Emily gave her that first year at the Desert Festival. The other mannequins were adorned with various costumes, ranging from silly to suave, from mysterious to monstrous. But they all have one thing in common. They're coming for the residents of the...